current talk was today about exploring people's normative judgments about future bias and temporal boundary asymmetry.
I say, okay, hi folks. I was going to start off by thanking the organisers. Everyone here, so I'm like, well, let's say that. Okay, this is the best slide. It's all downhill from here. This is Freddie when he was a little tiny puppy and he's so cute. Oh my God, look at his little legs. Okay, that's just for those of us who like dogs to get you in a good mood. So at the Centre for Time, over the last few years, we've been interested in doing a bunch of empirical work that explores a kind of nexus of issues. So some of those are issues about temporal experience and how people report their temporal experiences and what that might tell us about the nature of the experience itself. Some of it is about temporal beliefs about temporal ontology, beliefs about passage and so forth. And another kind of strand of that research has been on temporal preferences. That is preferences about where in time you prefer that stuff, events are located. And that's what I'm going to be interested in here today. Okay, so here's, roughly speaking, the plan. So I'm going to introduce you to future bias and the temporal value asymmetry, not assuming you already know what those things are. I'm going to explain by giving you a bunch of arguments why you should care about people's judgments about the normative properties of these things. Then I'm going to tell you about some studies we ran. So the empirical work here is joint work with Andrew Latham and Rita Lee, who aren't here, and Wen Yu, who is. And I'm going to kind of reflect on what this tells us about some of the connections between those things. The actual studies have a bunch more stuff packed in them that I'm actually going to talk to you about. I'm just going to tell you some of the bits that are most relevant for the questions I'm interested in here. Okay, so future bias. Future bias is a preference, all else being equal, to have positive events, that is, events that you yourself positively value, located in the past, the positive one, in the future rather than the past, and to have negative events, that is, ones that you negatively value, located in the past rather than the future. Okay. And the all else being equal here matters a good deal, right? So we might call something an apparent time bias if it's a preference just for where in time something is located. Now notice there's lots of reasons why you might have time bias preferences, right? So for instance, imagine you share a house with somebody and you have this piece of chocolate cake, right? So you can eat the cake at various points of time between now and later. But you think to yourself, if I leave this chocolate cake in the house, there's a very good chance that one of my roommates is going to eat this cake. So here's a reason why you might prefer cake sooner to cake later, namely cake sooner is more probable to cake later and you value cake, right? That seems like a very legitimate reason to have a cake sooner versus cake later preference. Likewise, here's an unfortunate feature of cake, it gets stale, right? So if you're projecting that your cake is going to get more stale, you might be choosing between fresh cake and stale cake, and fresh cake is preferable to stale cake, so that's a reason to prefer your cake sooner to later, because you're sensitive to the relative value of the cake. And there's lots of others of these kinds of considerations, right, which are reasons why you might prefer that things are located at one time rather than another. And some of these might be normatively relevant, and some of them might not be. Philosophy, time biases proper, as philosophers are typically interested in them, are not merely apparent ones. That is, they're the preferences you have when you hold fixed all of those other things. So one way of putting this is that they're preferences that are sensitive to temporal location per se, rather than some other factor which contingently happens to be connected to temporal location. Right? So staleness of cake is in fact contingently connected to temporal location, because as a matter of fact, cakes get stale, right? So cake further tends to be more stale. But if what you care about is cake staleness versus freshness, then holding fixed that your cake is as fresh at one time as it is at another, if you don't have time bias preferences, you'll be indifferent between those cakes, right? Because the cake is the same. So that's what I mean by all else being equal. So the idea is you still have that preference once we screen off all of those other things to which you might be sensitive. Now, there are disputes about exactly whether there is anything that's like that. Craig has poured shit on this idea. For current purposes, I'm going to assume that there's stuff, and I agree that there actually are some important issues here, but I just want to kind of skirt around that a bit. Okay. What else was I going to say here? All right. What the heck? Future bias in this case. So here's Parker's operation case, and I'm just going to read it out to you exactly as he has it, partly because it's delightful that he starts off with, I am in some hospital to have some kind of surgery. Only a philosopher could be like, I don't know, I'm sufficiently clueless, I don't really know where I am or what this surgery is, but like all I know is it's somewhere for some shit. Okay, but what he does know is that it's completely safe and always successful, right? And he has no fear about the effects. So notice what he's trying to do here is kind of screen off some of these things, right? So what he's trying to screen off is the idea that it might have different effects depending on where it is. All right. So then he says, look, the surgery may be brief or it may instead take a long time. But because I have to cooperate with the surgeon, I cannot have anesthetics. I've had this surgery once before and I can remember how painful it is. Under the new policy, fantastic new policy, because the operation is so painful, patients are now afterwards made to forget it. So a bit like colonoscopy. Some drug removes their memories of the last few hours, literally. Okay, I've just woken up. I can't remember going to sleep. I asked my nurse if it's been decided when my operation is to be and how long it must take. She says that she knows the facts about both me and another patient, but she can't remember which facts apply to whom. Again, we're in hospital here. But she can tell me only that the following is true. I may be the patient who had his operation yesterday. In that case, my operation was the longest ever performed, lasting 10 hours. I may instead be the patient who is to have a short operation later today. So it's either true that I did suffer for 10 hours or true that I shall suffer for 1 hour. Right? I asked the nurse to find out which is true. While she's away, it's clear to me which I prefer to be true. If I learn that the first is true, I shall be greatly relieved. So what part of this saying here is that he has future bias preferences, right? He prefers that his painful operation be in the past rather than the future. In fact, not only does he have a preference, he has a very strong and robust preference because what he's actually preferring is 10 times as much pain as long as it's in the past compared to a tenth as much pain if it's in the future. Okay, so empirical research tells us that Parfit, at least in this regard, is pretty normal. I can't speak to any of his other properties. People do in fact display future bias when it comes to a whole range of positive and negative events. And there's a bunch of studies, many of which we did, which show us that. And what's more, our studies also show that people do in fact prefer more pain in the past to less pain in the future. So we ran with the Parfit case, and people will actually do in fact prefer 10 hours of past pain to 1 hour of future pain, right? And they do also prefer less pleasure in the future to more pleasure in the past, although not quite as robustly. All right, so there's significant disagreement about whether future bias is rationally permissible. So Brian Hedden takes the view that it's permissible and that's all. Whether it's impermissible, and a whole bunch of people, Brink, Doherty, Green and Sullivan, take that view, or whether it's obligatory, and people like Pryor, Pearson and Hare take that view. Now notice that this is a debate about future bias, not apparent future bias. Right? So nobody thinks that it's irrational to be sensitive to how stable your cake is, or to various other, so obviously there might be some things that it's irrational to be sensitive to, but nobody thinks that all of those are ones that are rational. So the question here is whether being sensitive to temporal location per se is rational. Okay, so time neutralists, those are people who think that time bias preferences, including future bias ones, are not rational, often say something like the following. They say, look, temporal location is not normatively relevant, right? What can it matter exactly where something in time is located once you take away all of those other contingent things that you do care about, like the staleness of the cake and the probability of the cake and so forth, right? That's not a relevant thing, right? Just mere temporal location. And what's more, if you have this kind of robust future bias preferences, what you're doing is preferring a life with more pain to less pain, right? And that just sounds crazy. So, Graham tells me that he went to the Buying a Life store last night, right? There were only 2 lights left because we got there at 7:30 and in Switzerland stuff closes like at 7, so he got the bad life store. And there's only 2 lights left. They're exactly the same, except that one has a 10-hour operation on Monday and one has instead a 1-hour painful operation on Tuesday. And if he tells me, look, I went with the life that has the 1-hour painful operation instead of the 10 hours, what I feel like I would say to him is, what the fuck, right? Like, are there other ways to say all you did was sign up for an extra 9 hours, and the only difference is exactly which day they're on. Like, dude, that's the time neutralist intuition is basically, dude. Right. There's also a bunch of arguments, but I'm not going to give you those. On the other hand, there are people who think that future bias is obligatory, right? So they think that temporal location is normatively relevant. So they think, look, obviously it matters whether the thing is in the past or the future, right? Clearly, you should be relieved to discover that your 10-hour operation was yesterday rather than that it will be tomorrow, right? That just seems obvious. They're like, look, if that's not your preference, what the fuck is wrong with you, right? So both of these people think that the kind of opponent is a bit loopy in some way. You should prefer pains to be over and done with, as they would often put it, rather than impending, right? And you should prefer that pleasures are the things sort of still to come and not over and done with. All right. So there's a big disagreement there about the normative status, and there are lots of arguments. But here's one thing that people almost uniformly seem to agree about, which is this chapter, which is that most of us will judge that future bias preferences are rational. That is, that they're at least permissible and likely obligatory. And I'm going to call this the empirical claim about normative judgment, since it is, after all, an empirical claim about what people are inclined to judge. And you might think, why would we care about that claim? Well, I think whether that claim is true is actually turns out to be important for several reasons, because that empirical claim plays a role in a bunch of different arguments for various different conclusions. And I'm just going to briefly give you a little sense of those. Notice I am not defending any of these arguments. So I'm calling this the gung-ho argument for obvious reasons, because this premise one is really coming out swinging, right? So it says, look, if people robustly and after reflection judge that future bias is rational, the best explanation of this is that they're tracking normatively relevant properties which ground the rationality of future bias, right? Notice in big red light, lights here, I am not defending this claim. Right? Do not think that this claim is likely to be true. But if the best explanation of that is that people's judgments is that they are tracking those normatively relevant things, then we should think that future bias is rational. This is kind of, instance of inference to best explanation, make of that what you will. Then we have this empirical claim. People do robustly and after reflection judge future bias to be rational, so we should conclude that it is rational. I'm not sure I've ever seen this set out quite like this, but I do think something like this is kind of in the ether. And so notice that this is relying on this empirical claim. Here's a less ambitious argument, which if I were a defender of future bias, I think I would put my heart into a little more, which is, look, it's a good making feature of the view that, and a reason, albeit a defeasible one to accept it, that it vindicates our robust and post-reflection normative judgments. Not defending that either, but I feel like that is more defensible. People do robustly and after reflection judge future bias to be rational. So again, this is our empirical claim. But given to the view that future bias is rational does vindicate our various judgments, right? So it's a good making feature of that view, of the view that future bias is rational, and therefore it's a defeasible reason to accept it, right? So the thought here is just, look, people do robustly judge that future bias is normatively rational, and that gives us a reason, albeit a defeasible one, to think that future bias is in fact rational. Okay, it also plays a role in a kind of challenge that I think has been kind of given to time neutralists. So here's the thought. The defender of future bias says, look, you, oi, time neutralist, right? You tell me that future bias is irrational, but like everyone around me, including you, kind of have this intuition that future bias is in fact rational, right? People tend to judge that. So dude, you better give me some kind of explanation of what's going on here, mate, right? Why is it that people are all over the place up their asses, as it were, normatively speaking, right, to use a technical term. Brain business. Okay, so notice that, in fact, time neutralists have offered various accounts of why we are future biased, right? So, sort of going back to Hume, but then Horwich, Sewell and Callender, Dyke and Maclaurin, Caruso, etc., have accounts that appeal to a bunch of kind of mechanisms. There are various things that time neutralists have said about why we have future bias preferences, right, which I'm not really going to talk about. But notice it's not straight away obviously explaining why we judge those things to be rational, right? So obviously you can have an explanation for why we have a certain sort of capacity or a certain preference, and it may not be that that automatically explains why we therefore judge it to be rational. And of course it might do that work, but it's just not, it's not straightforward. Okay, here's another argument that also rests on this empirical claim. So It's sometimes said that future bias is a manifestation of the temporal value asymmetry, and elsewhere I call this the manifestation thesis. And the thought here is, look, if future bias is a manifestation of the temporal value asymmetry, then if some explanation completely explains the temporal value asymmetry, then it completely explains future bias. And then people kind of give some explanation of the temporal value asymmetry, and people give different explanations here. But the idea is that having given that explanation, you therefore completely explain future bias, right? You've discharged your obligation to do that. So what's important here is the thought that, look, no independent explanation of future bias is required here. Once we've got an explanation of the temporal value asymmetry, we're good to go, right? But that's only true if this manifestation thesis is true. Okay, so the manifestation thesis says that future bias is a manifestation of this thing, which is the temporal value asymmetry. What's that? Well, the temporal value asymmetry refers to the fact that people tend to assign more value to an event when it's in the future compared to when it's equidistant in the past. So in the case of negative events, that means you assign them less negative value when they're in the past compared to in the future. And in the case of positive events, it means you assign them more positive value when they're in the future compared to in the past. Right? There's a classic Caruso-Gilbert-Wilson study in 2008 which kind of kicked all this off. And it's sometimes taken to show that people are future biased, but actually what they were probing was the temporal value asymmetry. And here's just to give you a kind of sense of how this goes. This is just a few snippets of what they did. So the first study, what they found is that people will award more monetary compensation for work that's going to be completed in the future compared to work that was completed equidistant in the past. Likewise, they'll award a victim of drug driving accident more monetary compensation when the resulting pain and suffering occurs in the future compared to in the past. And they'll give a more expensive bottle of wine to a friend for use of vacation home in the future compared to if they used the vacation home in the past, right? And there's a bunch of other instances of this. Okay, so then according to the manifestation thesis, having future bias preferences is really just a product of this temporal value asymmetry and doing something like kind of maximizing value from your current perspective. And I think the idea is something like this. Look, if you discount the value of past events compared to future ones, which is just what it is to have this temporal value asymmetry, then if from your current perspective you're maximizing value, of course you're going to prefer that when an event is positive, it's located in the future, right, not the past. Because if it's in the future, it's worth more to you than if it's in the past, right? That's what the temporal value asymmetry is. Likewise, of course, you're going to prefer that a negative event is in the past rather than the future, because if it's in the past, it's less bad than if it's in the future. So all you're really doing in having future bias preferences is manifesting wanting to kind of maximize value from where you are, combined with the fact that the things in the past have less value than the things in the future, right? And the idea is this just explains future bias. Okay. But recently, I think this was kind of more or less accepted terrain, but recently there's been some arguments against the manifestation thesis, which goes something like this. So the thought is, look, if future bias really is just a manifestation of the temporal value asymmetry, then surely people will display a temporal value asymmetry under the same circumstances as they display future bias, because after all, one is just a manifestation of the other, and surely they'll make the same normative judgments about them. And then the thought is, people don't make the same normative judgments about them. This claim I'm going to call the perceived normative asymmetry claim. Therefore, future bias isn't a manifestation of the temporal value asymmetry. And I think Christoph Hurl might be the first person about 2022 to start articulating something like this. Okay, and this is important because if future bias isn't a manifestation of the temporal value asymmetry, then it doesn't follow that when we've explained one, we've explained the other, right? So there might be some residual stuff that we have to do in explaining future bias, which is kind of what I'm interested in. All right. So, in 2022, we find Hurl predicting that the normative asymmetry claim, the perceived normative asymmetry claim is true because he predicts that A, people will judge that the temporal value asymmetry is not permissible, but he also thinks that people are going to judge that future bias is rational, right? So this is he thinks, look, there's going to be this perceived normative asymmetry between these things, and he thinks, well, obviously that means the manifestation thesis is false. So what's his evidence for this? Well, his evidence for the claim about people thinking that the temporal value asymmetry is impermissible comes from that original Caruso study, which is indirect evidence. So Caruso, in fact, draw the conclusion that people judge the temporal value asymmetry to be irrational based on the fact that in their studies, people only display that asymmetry in the between subjects condition, not the within subject condition. So what does that mean? So as we'll see shortly, what they do is they give people little vignettes. And the vignette describes something that can happen. In this case, it's doing work, and it's either described as being in the future in one vignette or being in the past in the other vignette. So in the between subjects condition, you see one vignette. There's some work that was done in the future, and you ask, how much money should you get for this work, right? And some people see the future one, and some people see the past one, and then you aggregate this data, and what you find is that on average as a population, people are awarding more compensation for the future work than the past work. In the within subjects condition, you see both of the vignettes. You see one and you award compensation, you see the other and you award compensation. So you know what compensation you awarded for the other case, right? And they don't find any temporal value asymmetry there. And what they think is something like, look, what this tells us is that people are kind of disposed, I think Alison puts it like this, people are predisposed to have a temporal value asymmetry, but when it's kind of in your face and they can see it, right? They can see, oh, I awarded, $300 for this past work. They then think, oh, I should award the same amount for the future work, because actually they don't think it's rational to award more money for future work than past work, right? This is, of course, indirect evidence about this. But nevertheless, Pearl thinks this is, Pearl and Caruso think this is a reason to think people will have that view about the temporal value asymmetry. And Pearl just predicts that people will, in fact, judge that future bias is rational, right? Just based on self-reflection and talking to his mates. Which is a perfectly fine thing to do in the absence of any other evidence. But there's no direct evidence about either of these things, and there's really no evidence about future bias at all. So notice we've got this empirical claim about normative judgments, which plays a role in a bunch of quite different arguments. Arguments about whether the manifestation thesis is true, arguments that support the rationality of future bias in some sense or other, right? But we don't actually know whether that claim is true or not. And we've got this perceived normative asymmetry claim, which plays this role in the argument against the manifestation thesis being true. So we wanted to find out whether, in fact, people have, what judgments people actually have in this regard. So we ran a bunch of studies. So the first study just aimed to replicate the original results of Caruso, showing that there really is this difference in the between versus within subject condition, which gives you some reason to think that you get this, that people think that the temporal value asymmetry is irrational. But then we wanted to actually directly probe their judgments by asking them some shit, right? Rather than just indirectly inferring. And then we also wanted to do some further experiments on future bias and to directly probe people's judgments about whether future bias is rational or not. Okay, so these are the original vignettes that Caruso used. Day of work past, day of work future. All that really matters here is that you have some shitty data entry job. It's not appalling, but it's not great. You need the money. You've got to do it for 5 hours. So the job is exactly the same, but either you already did the job in the past or you will be doing the job in the future. Like, how much dosh do you want, right? And you either see one of them or you see both, and in both cases you've got to say how much you're worth. And people really get lost. Okay, so they ask them, how much total money do you feel you should receive for this 5 hours work? Okay. So then, however, unlike Caruso, we explicitly ask people for their normative judgments. So they see these, they'll see all of them. If they saw both vignettes, they'll see some combination. If they only saw one, right? So we say, look, if the job of putting the data into the computer was last month, it's acceptable for me to be awarded less money than if it's next month. And then they have to respond on a like-it scale, like how much they agree or disagree with this confronting statement. And the next one is, if the job of importing data was last month, I should be awarded less money. Right. So we're trying to probe here both whether they think it's obligatory and whether they think it's permissible, and likewise the other way around. Okay. So then we wanted to kind of further probe this, because you want to try and get at people lots of different ways. So then you can see a vignette of Ben and Sandra discussing compensation in the past and future, and they're sort of articulating reasons either why you might award more money in the future compared to the past, or why you shouldn't, because we wanted to see whether that would push people around and what people would say about this kind of reasoning. Right? So that's I'm not going to read all this out, but basically Ben and Sandra are given the task of awarding compensation to their colleague Judith, who let's just suppose they like Judith. And so Ben says, look, it matters whether Judith's data entry was in the past or the future, because, look, it's boring work. And if it's boring work, if it's in the past, she's already been bored, the boredom is over and done with. If it's in the future, she still has got to do it. Like, yada, 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 right? Whereas Sandra says, look, it doesn't matter when it occurred. All that matters is how long it took her, right? And how boring it was. But it doesn't matter if she did it in the past or she's doing it in the future. We should give her the same amount of money. Then we ask people whether Judith should be awarded more money in the future versus the past, or the past versus the future, or whether it should make no difference to how much is awarded. Okay. So then people see the future bias vignette. So this is the disliked meal. There are various variants of probing future bias. I went with our Norton, Latham, Green, Miller, Shiznett. Disliked meal one, but not on a spaceship. Right, so the idea is you're certain to get this shitty meal, right, against a backdrop of just bland meals, but you don't know when. The question is, would you prefer that you already had shitty meal or that you still have to eat shitty meal? And you have to, you know, like there's no other meals to be had here. You can't replace your shit meal with some other thing because you're obligated to eat your company's food because like you work at a company. All right, and then people ask the typical future bias question, like, what do you prefer about your most disliked meal, right? Whether you prefer that you have it or do you have no preference? But then we also followed up with, look, it's acceptable for you to prefer that it was yesterday rather than tomorrow. It's acceptable to prefer that it was tomorrow rather than yesterday. You should prefer that it was yesterday rather than tomorrow. Oh, there must be one missing, which is the converse of that, right? Then we also gave them another vignette. Again, it's Ben and Sandra, they're discussing Judith, they're discussing what Judith should prefer. It's a little bit of a weird conversation for colleagues to be having, but you know, you can see how it might go, but maybe not with food. So Ben says that she should prefer that her most disliked meal was yesterday, right, for the same sorts of reasons, because then it's over and done with and she doesn't have to, you know, she's not still awaiting this horrible meal. It's better that the unpleasant meal be over and done with. So she should prefer that it was yesterday. Sandra disagrees. Sandra says, look, the badness of the unpleasant meal is the same, regardless of when she gets it. It shouldn't make any difference to Judith whether she's already received it or whether she's about to receive it, right? It's going to be equally unpleasant for Judith, right? Whether it's a past self that gets it or a future self that gets it. Then we ask people whether Judith should prefer, we give them these statements, she should prefer it yesterday rather than tomorrow, she should prefer it tomorrow rather than yesterday, or she should have any preference, and we again give them the capacity to reply on the Likert scale. Okay, so what did we find? So we thought we would replicate the presence of the temporal value asymmetry in the between subjects condition, not the within subjects condition, that is to replicate the original Caruso experiment. However, we didn't do this. We didn't find any temporal value asymmetry in either condition, and I'll talk a bit about that shortly. Interestingly though, when we explicitly asked people about the rationality of the temporal value asymmetry in all of these cases, participants strongly disagreed that they should be, or that it was acceptable to be, awarded less money for past compared to future work, exactly as Pearl predicted and as Caruso thought. So here what we find is that a very robust finding, like you're in the high 80% of people saying that it's not acceptable and that you shouldn't do this. And that's them responding to the question about whether they themselves should be awarded more money depending on like where the work is. Then when we move to the Judith case, we find almost exactly the same percentages, which is nice that people are a bit coherent, you know. So we find that, yeah, look, Judith shouldn't be awarded more money, whether it's future or past. It should make no difference. 85% of people say, like, it shouldn't make any difference when she did this work. So overall, people strongly disagree that it's rationally permissible, let alone obligatory, to have this kind of temporal value asymmetry, which is consistent with what Caruso originally thought, but not for the reasons I think that he originally thought it. Okay, so we also then find when we look at the future bias case that we replicate that people are future biased. So people do in fact prefer their most disliked meal to be in the past, not future. That's not that exciting because that's already been replicated before. We then ask, remember, is it acceptable or is it obligatory to have that kind of preference? So this is, remember, people responding about their own preferences. So here what we find is, again, pretty high percentages of people saying that, about 80% of people saying that they should prefer the the horrible meal to be yesterday, not tomorrow, and about the same percent saying that it's acceptable. So the acceptability judgments and the obligatory judgments basically just go in lockstep, right? So if you think it's acceptable, you think it's obligatory. All right. And then we look at the case of Judas, right, where people are reflecting on what Judas should prefer, not just on what they think they themselves should prefer. And again, we get almost exactly the same percentages, which is always nice. So again, about 80% of people are like, yeah, Judas should prefer the meal in the past, right? So it doesn't really matter whether people are reflecting on their own preferences or they're thinking about what Judas should do. All right, so we do find that people are future biased and that they judge that future bias is both permissible and obligatory. And again, that's in keeping with Hurl's predictions about what people will judge here. So you might think this is kind of uninteresting and unexciting because you might just think, well, it was obvious that people were going to make those judgments. However, in this literature, people have made various other claims about what's obvious about people's views about future bias. None of the others are true. None of the other things that people predicted actually turned out to be true. So this is one of those cases where I was like, oh, people were right. Okay, so we've indicated both the perceived normative asymmetry claim. People do have different normative views about the temporal value asymmetry and future bias. And we've indicated this empirical claim about normative judgment, that is, people do judge future bias to be obligatory. Now, of course, that doesn't show that any of those previous arguments for the rationality of future bias succeed, right? So I'm not here to tell you that, to try and argue in favour of the rationality of future bias. But what it does show is that if they fail, it's not because that empirical premise about people's normative judgments is false, right? That claim is actually a pretty good claim. So if you want to resist those, you have to resist that somewhere else. And it does show that the time neutralist does have some explanation that they need to offer here about why people robustly judge future bias to be rational, given that they themselves, the time neutralists, think that it's not. Okay, so we didn't replicate the findings of Caruso, though, in terms of finding asymmetry in this temporal value asymmetry, because we just didn't find any temporal value asymmetry at all. People said, yeah, that would be irrational, and what's more, they didn't do it. But actually, it turns out that in light of some more recent evidence, we should have been less surprised about this than we were. So it actually turns out to corroborate several recent studies. And those studies suggest that there probably is a temporal value asymmetry, but it's relatively kind of weak and inconsistent and inconstant, right? So there's a study by a bunch of psychologists, and then Burns, McCormick, etc. Caruso himself in 2019, and then in 2014, Caruso, Latham, and I also found similar kind of inconstancy. So notice this means that we also found what we might call a descriptive asymmetry between the actual patterns of the temporal value asymmetry and patterns of future bias, right? So it's not just that people have a different normative view about these things, it's that actually people are pretty robustly displaying a future bias in a way that they're not robustly displaying a temporal value asymmetry. But think back to the manifestation thesis, right? And it said that if one is a manifestation of the other, you kind of expect them to be manifested at the same time, right? Doing the same stuff, as well as people having the same normative judgments. But in fact, of course, what this suggests is that not only do they have different normative judgments, but they're not actually manifested in the same conditions, because one's manifested much more robustly than another. And that seems like another reason to reject the manifestation thesis. And then when we look at developmental studies, this also suggests a kind of further descriptive asymmetry. So actually it turns out that you find the temporal value asymmetry appearing relatively late in developmental terms, whereas Ruth Lee and colleagues found that children as young as 4 display future bias preferences. But again, if one is a manifestation of the other, developmentally, like, they should be coming online at about the same time. So this also suggests that they come apart. Okay, so there's kind of general form of a problem here, which is that both time neutralists and defenders of the rationality of future bias tend to think that future bias and the temporal value asymmetry have the same normative status. Right? Time neutralists think they're both shit, and future bias defenders tend to think they're both great, right? Or both obligatory. So it seems like what we all want to find is some at least partial explanation of the temporal value asymmetry and future bias, which is in some sense not shared, right? It's the thing that explains why they're not manifested together, but which has 2 features. So it needs to leave future bias and the temporal value asymmetry with the same normative status. So it can't be something that kind of makes one of them rational, the other not, assuming that we here are either time neutralists or future bias defenders. And it needs to also maybe explain why we accord them different normative statuses, right? So that the further kind of thing that's doing the explanatory work kind of needs to be something that can shed light on look, this explains why these are kind of two separate, though maybe they're overlapping phenomena in some way. And the fact that this explains one of these phenomena distinctly from the other is also what explains why we have these different attitudes towards them. At least you might think this is the way to go. Okay, so what could F star be, right? So one suggestion is that some future bias might be a case of temporal relief. So temporal relief is the kind of relief you have when some kind of painful or otherwise unpleasant episode has actually taken place and is now ended. So it's the typical kind of priorient thought that, like, thank fuck, that's over, right? As opposed to what Hurl calls counterfactual relief. So that's just the relief that something's less bad than it might have been. So when you discover that your faculty meeting is 1 hour instead of 5, you have counterfactual relief, right? When you discover you're exiting the Faculty of Arts and entering the Faculty of Science, you have counterfactual relief. So temporal relief is often the relief that we have in mind. And a first thought you might have had is that many people have had, is that temporal relief itself is just a manifestation of a temporal value asymmetry. So here's what you might think. Look, of course we have temporal relief because once some negative thing has passed, is in the past, we value it less. So it makes sense that we are relieved that it's, as it were, over and done with. And being relieved that it's over and done with, it's sort of nothing more than seeing that it's now less valuable to us, right? The previous dental procedure is done, and so it's less bad, right? But recently, both Hurl and Bacharach have suggested that actually that can't be the right account of temporal relief either, for very similar argumentative reasons to the reasons I've given, that future bias and the temporal value asymmetry can't be the same. Which is they say, look, people tend to judge that temporal value asymmetry is irrational. We now know that's true. And they say, but look, surely people think that temporal relief is appropriate, right? Surely when Graham comes to me and says, oh, thank fuck, that faculty meeting is over, right? I think, yeah, damn straight, right? I may not think it's obligatory, but I definitely think it's permissible, right? So I don't have, as far as I know, there's no evidence about that, but I'd be pretty astonished if people were like, no, temporal relief, that's not rational, right? But if that's true, then it doesn't look like temporal relief is just a manifestation of the temporal value asymmetry either. So one proposal is that temporal relief plays this F star role. Right, so the thought is, look, temporal relief is itself a kind of separate psychological phenomenon from the temporal value asymmetry. Those are distinct, and then future bias, at least when it comes to negative events, might be partly a matter of temporal relief, which is this distinct thing from the temporal value asymmetry. And then the thought is, look, the reason we have these different normative judgments is that we take temporal relief to be at least permissible, maybe obligatory. And so that, because future bias is kind of a manifestation of that relief that things are over, it inherits that kind of normative status in our eyes, whereas the temporal value asymmetry is this other thing which doesn't have that status. And alternatively, Caruso, Andrew and I suggested that it might be the product of both. So it might partly be about the temporal value asymmetry, might partly explain future bias, but if temporal relief is also playing a role there, it might be that our normative judgments are more swayed by the temporal reliefy aspect, and that's why we tend to judge that future bias is obligatory, but the temporal value asymmetry is not, because that doesn't have any aspect of temporal relief in it. However, so there's still a bit of pause here. I mean, we don't know that that's true. We have some studies on temporal relief coming up, but we don't know. But interestingly, that doesn't look like it's going to work for positive future bias, right? So if I prefer that the great event is tomorrow rather than yesterday, there's no temporal relief in there at all, right? And if I judge that that's obligatory, then I can't appeal to temporal relief to explain what the normative status of that judgment might be. Now, interestingly, our study only looked at the kind of negative future bias case, so we don't actually know what people's normative judgments are about positive events. That would be a good follow-up. But if, in fact, they judge, I mean, it's possible that they don't judge them to be obligatory. Maybe they just judge them to be kind of permissible to have that. I don't know. But if they do judge them to be obligatory, then the full story can't be some combination of temporal relief or temporal value asymmetry. There has to be some further chat, Megan, right? And she has to be doing some explanatory work here in explaining why we have these future bias preferences, to which we have this kind of normative judgment. And I actually don't know who Megan is in this case. And so I think that's kind of where the work here, I think, is in figuring out what actually is the connection between temporal relief, the temporal value asymmetry, future bias, and Megan, and finding out who Megan is. Because I think that's kind of important in terms of figuring out the status of the manifestation thesis, figuring out the kind of status of these other arguments, and understanding how these things fit together. So that's kind of where I see research going. So I think that I'm good.
Any more questions? We'll start with Alison.
And we will all be appropriately quick at both ends of this question-answer juncture.
I'm curious about the first third-person asymmetries, particularly in the way of checking the normative status. You know, so if I think it's rational for me, then I should probably think it's rational for you. Whereas if it's people like first-person or training effects, maybe it'll apply to me more than to you. So in the study that you did, is there a way of checking if the first person and third person kind of ran together? Were people given like the first personal scenario and the third personal one together, so they're likely to judge the same thing, or is it the kind of thing where they were asked in different orders?
Oh no, of course the orders were randomized. Yeah.
So did you do like a check on like whether if you sort of ignore the people, as a between subject design, whether there is a first?
Oh yeah, there's no effect of. We did a between and within subject design for the future bias as well, and there was no effect there. In the same way, there's no effect for the temporal value asymmetry. But also, we know there's no effect of first and third person for future bias, right? Because there's some effect, but it's not a very big effect. That people treat those cases the same. So actually, this is not surprising to me.
I leave that for that.
So what I was thinking about is whether different sorts of goods or bads might have particular kinds of maybe cultural norms around them or different ways to think about them, such that we might have a value asymmetry for some that and not others. So one that I was thinking of is compensation for work. Like all work basically is compensated after you do it usually. And so even though I might think if there's something else I do then I might go, well, that's over now, it's gone, it's completely nothing. If my boss came to me and said, don't worry about the work you did yesterday, it's over, it's gone now, it's completely nothing, I would just be like, get out and greedy capitalist and that. So there's a particular culture around work that means that we don't dismiss it even though it's in the past. So I was wondering if you have or thinking of doing these sorts of tests. You basically give you the same kind of question, testing the same thing, but with different sorts of goods and bads, like compensation work or sensations, tests.
Yeah, so it's a good question. So Caruso's original study, of course, does have a whole bunch of different, like he has I only gave you 3, but he actually does a whole bunch and he has effects. I think not on all of them, but on a whole bunch of them, which I guess already should have been some reason to think that the value asymmetry is a bit inconstant. But we only went with the work one. I sort of doubt that it's making much of a difference here, but it would be worth looking into. We've certainly We've done future bias vignettes on a range of different things, not just like pains and pleasures, and you still find that effect regardless of what it is. But yeah, that's definitely something you could do, is to look at different things that people are compensating in the temporal value asymmetry case. Yeah.
Oh, that was my question.
That was your question? Yeah. Super. Great.
Excellent, thanks for that. And obviously, I really hope that that's not the last Kristie Miller lecture that I get to see. That would be very sad.
Unless one or both of us are going to die. One requires one of us, obviously.
I mean, as long as I don't die, philosophically, that's fine. No. So one of the things, and this is in the spirit of Craig having poured shit on the IBA, the Craig's got this thought. There's a lot of stuff packed into our understanding of time, and it's very hard to separate out neatly. One of the things, particularly on my view, that's very closely related is what you might call imperfectivity, or so what we have with verb aspects, so the difference between something happening, present continuous, and something having happened.
Yeah.
And in fact, in languages like Yoruba, they don't have any tense in the language. They do it all through aspects, using imperfectivity to mark the difference between past and future. So that thought that whether something is done might be doing different work to where its location is in time. And particularly the way you frame the question was just suggested, of the compensation question suggests that we're not dealing with something done. Because if the compensation hasn't been finished, it's not done. Whereas from the point of view of experiencing the bad-making features, it might be done.
Right.
And so we might be kind of shifting around the doneness by changing our perspective.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I mean, I guess that's worth following up on. I mean, I don't have anything on the temporal value asymmetry here, but we do know that, contrary to expectation, people are future biased even about non-experiential things. And I guess there's a sense in which they are not done in the, well, they're not done in the same sense that
things might not be done right. So is my life going well? Well, you know, it depends on future stuff because it's not done.
Sure. Yeah, I need to think about that. I'm not sure.
Okay, great, thanks. I wanted to go back to think a little bit about the not replicating Caruso and everything. And I was trying to think about various reasons why. And I think maybe slightly related to Graham's point, but one thing we could think with things like compensation is you're typically still expecting to get the compensation in the present or the future. So the money, and people give a lot of value to money. And in either case, you're saying, well, you'll get paid for work you did a month ago, you'll get paid for work you're doing in a month. I still want to get cash. So wherever it's in the past or the future, you might think, well, as long as I'm getting the money now to spend, then it's actually could be, in some ways, a manifestation of the future bias. To just think, well, if I'm going to get the money in the future, I want to maximize that to whatever seems sensible. It's the money I value, and that might kind of override these kind of valuations of work, which are playing a role there as well.
Yeah, so it's true that you get the compensation, I guess, in the short-term future, kind of regardless. I think the setup is the same in our experiment as in theirs, so it's still puzzling that it doesn't. So you might have thought if they didn't find that effect, but they predicted it, you might have thought that's some kind of explanation. But I think that can't be the explanation of the difference because the experiment is exactly the same in both cases. And they clearly find it in a way. And other experiments have clearly found temporal value asymmetry in various things. So I think there definitely is that phenomenon. But yes, you're right, that case has the setup that one of you'll get the money future-wise regardless of where the work was taking place. Nevertheless, we definitely find that, well, they definitely found that at population level, people are wanting more for the future work, even, than the past work. And I don't know if that's it doesn't seem like that's all straightforwardly impacted by our future bias. Because they're going to get the money in the future, kind of regardless, right, of how much they're awarding it. But yeah, it's worth thinking about that.
Thanks, that was great. When I foreshit on the idea, I don't think I'm doing that really in a way that matters to you. It just matters to the sort of setup of your arguments you're doing. The data is the data, the patterns are the patterns that you're getting.
No, I agree. Yeah.
So
I didn't want to have a slide praying for shit on people, but no, it wasn't meant. I didn't get any on me. I'm good. I felt like the full hazmat suit on.
Yeah, but I think there's it's useful to do the foreshitting on because it suggests hypotheses to explain these differences. So so I look at the Parfit case, I think, oh my God, I'm in one condition I'm anticipating, I've got anticipating sucks, and the other, if the operation was a couple days ago, I'll get out of the hospital earlier, then maybe I can make this party next week.
Yeah, right.
In the temporal value case, I'm thinking, oh my God, I've got all these meetings, in 2 months, and how much you should pay me that I have to cancel all those things. And then, of course, there's the uncertainty, and so you can't really disentangle time from all these other things.
Yeah.
But those things might end up being useful for explaining some of these patterns.
That's right. Yeah, and you're right. It's impossible to write anything yet that actually factors out all those things because individual people are going to bring those kind of things to the table. So we've actually got some work on kind of negative and positive weighting and its effects on time bias preferences. And we're at the moment running some follow-up sort of studies to the stuff that Ruth Lee's been doing and McCormick, etc., on the effects of memories. They've got that nice recent study where they either have the people having just temporary memory loss, but it'll come back versus not, and they're trying to figure out how much of a role does the fact that I'm going to remember this shitty thing play in kind of my preferences for where it is, and if I don't remember it, what impact does that have, and how does it vary from little kids to human adults? And so we're kind of doing some follow-up on that because we're interested in the interaction between kind of memory effects, weighting effects, anticipation, like how much of a factor is kind of anticipation in these things. So I think that's right. I'd like to know what sorts of things that those are playing. And I agree that it's impossible to kind of screen off all that stuff and try and test for just pure bias. And I agree.
Thanks. So this is cool. I want to get clear on what you found evidence of and what's sort of still up for grabs in the study that you've done. So there's this robust finding that people judge future bias to be permissible and obligatory, but the kind of cases that they're making judgments about are ones in which the good or the bad thing in the future or the past was just as good or just as bad. And not the sort of case that where you sort of pump up the past to make it more pleasure or more pain in the past, that kind of preference that leads Graham to prefer the life that has more pain overall and gets you worried. So I just wanted to that's still a good question, right?
That's another question. So I definitely think that's the next one. That's another next place. So I think Craig's next place is one place to go, and that next place, So it could well. I'm not sure what to predict about that. So option one, people are just as sure that a kind of robust preference is obligatory. So they think, look, Grant should be preferring 10 hours yesterday to 1 hour tomorrow. Like option one is actually there's no difference. Option two is, you shift people from maybe a lower percentage, but you still get acceptable and obligatory going in lockstep. So now you get like 65% of people thinking both. Another option, you pull apart permissible and obligatory. So now maybe you get people saying, oh, it's permissible to be like that, but it's not obligatory. Or maybe you get people shifting all the way the other end, where maybe being like, no, it's neither of those things. So I think that's a really interesting question, and running something that I think that just actually compares those two conditions to see what the difference is. I think that's also a really good follow-up, because I think that would be kind of fascinating to see. Like, we can do that. Like, let's do that. Good, we're done.
Thank you very much. So just make sure I understand real quickly. So most philosophers on either side of the issue, they either think both future bias and TVA is irrational, or so they either think neither is irrational, or they think both is rational.
Right.
Either is rational.
And I don't know whether that's how much of that's a kind of independent motivation, or how much it's the fact that they kind of think of them as a package that is sort of the same thing. So it may not be that what they thought is, oh, these are distinct things, and what's more, obviously each of them is rational / irrational, as opposed to thinking that it's sort of the same phenomenon, and then obviously you're going to think, but that because people slide between them, so sometimes it seems like people are talking about temporal relief, sometimes it seems like they're talking about future bias, sometimes it seems like they're talking about temporal value asymmetry. In fact, philosophers often took that original Caruso study to just be about future bias. So I don't want to make it sound like people have clearly articulated and being like, yes, these all must stand or fall together. I think it's more, so maybe so there is a third position which someone could have, which is, look, now I see that these are distinct phenomena, I take a different view about which of them is permissible versus not. But I think that might be it's sort of a bit hard to see how that would go.
Well, so I wanted to suggest that third position, but maybe it just reflects a different understanding I have of TVA.
Okay, so go for it, yeah.
So I mean, it seems to me future bias does seem rational. It seems, right? So maybe if you have a kind of a theoretic view in the background, so it seems to me maybe, plausibly, future bias is rational because, look, it hasn't happened yet, it's going to happen, I'm looking forward to it, if it's a good thing, and so on. But then with the temporal value asymmetry, it seems to me it's not right to say really that any of them are valuable. One of them was valuable, another one will be valuable, and it seems wrong to say that something that was valuable could change with respect to, I mean, something can't be in the case that it will be valuable to a certain amount, and then after it happens, it's switched how valuable it was, right? So, I don't know, to me, that's one way of maybe trying to break them apart, I don't know.
Yeah, so I see that's a way forward. So obviously, many of the people who think that future bias is rational are actually motivated by this, by temporal metaphysics of that kind. they do typically say things that make you think that they think that it's rational to discount past stuff as well as just to be future bias. So some of them even say something that makes it sound a bit like, look, it's over and done with. It should have no value to you at all. It should be, should have a complete discount rate. But I agree that there's space here for a view in which you don't say that. We actually, just while I've got you, we actually have some work looking at not whether that is a good explanation for future bias, the kind of temporal metaphysics, but whether people's experience of time and views about time in that regard have any impact on whether they are future bias. So you might have thought that people who kind of think of time as flowing in that way might be more likely to be future biased, particularly if you think that that is in fact what explains it. But no, just out of interest. Yeah, but I do think exploring, pulling those apart would be an interesting way to go.
Thanks.
Thank you. The talk was great. So the last part of the talk was really quickly.
Sorry. I saw. Dave was flashing at me. I just wanted to say that. So I had to really start wrapping things up.
So I was a bit confused about how different temporal relief was from future bias and how it was supposed to fill in the role of F-star, if that was how it was supposed to play a role in your theory. So I don't know if you can very quickly explain that to me again.
Yeah, so Christoph and some other people have a view of temporal relief as being separate from the temporal value asymmetry. So it's this other thing, which is not just about devaluing the past. And then their thought is that, at least when it comes to you and I having a preference for like the dental procedure to be yesterday rather than tomorrow, their thought is something like, look, future bias about bad stuff is just a manifestation of being relieved that it's over. So the thought is, look, because I have this kind of relief state, that's what leads me to have the preference that the thing is in the past rather than the future. So that's kind of like one proposal is like put in some independent account of temporal relief, which doesn't go via the temporal value asymmetry. And that could, I guess there's various ways you could do that, and Hurl has one account and Backrack has a different. And then one proposal is just kind of identify negative future bias with that thing. And then I guess another proposal would be temporal relief is some part of an explanation for negative future bias, but maybe there's something else as well. Maybe it's the temporal value asymmetry, maybe there's some other guy, Jeremy, who's another kind of partial explanation, but we don't know what that is. But temporal relief is kind of some part of that explanation. And then the idea is that the fact that we take temporal relief to be kind of appropriate is what motivates us to think that future bias is rational. That's in a very abstract.
It helps.
Okay, good.
Like towards the start of the talk, you said something. You said that like the temporal value asymmetry and future bias, like they don't have a common source. But what I'm wondering is if so something maybe in that general ballpark might have I think like Canada and stuff that said that maybe it's like an evolutionary explanation, right? It's like we haven't evolved to cry over spilled milk, or less over milk that can be not spilled. And then maybe, I mean, people are quite kind of bad at evaluating their own beliefs and preferences. And what I'm thinking is these are quite like philosophical packages of things that, wouldn't really be clear. Maybe by putting them into different terms or presenting them in different ways. So even the fact that one of them is called an asymmetry or a bias implies that maybe you shouldn't believe it. And then maybe they might come up with all these different, that's when their views might start to come apart. So what I'm saying is they could all actually have a common psychological basis, but could it be that actually this kind of all this diversity of people's evaluations of them, whether or not they're obligatory, permissible, it could be a kind of packaging thing.
I see. Yes, so I guess there's two aspects to that. So I definitely think that there are going to be some kind of core mechanisms that are in common between these kind of phenomena. And yeah, so Craig has a story, an older story with Sula. And then since then, people have, like Caruso and colleagues, have kind of built on that, so more about the actual psychological mechanisms for that. And there's actually quite a detailed story to be told there. And I do think that various bits of that story are for sure going to explain bits of these things. I'm not sure whether there's going to be one whole package that explains them all. So your thought is I definitely think that something like that is going to be right. Your thought is, well, it could explain them all because maybe what's going on is that actually these results have been skewed in some way by people's sort of prior beliefs about stuff. So that's an interesting thought. I think that, so we're not testing like undergraduates or philosophers. We're testing like your random person. So I'd be surprised if they'd have heard the word future bias. So of course in the studies we never use in terms like bias, which of course would naturally lead you to think, well, that can't be a good thing, right? If you call something future bias, people are like, shit, no, that's not me, right? So all we do is present people with, look, there's some painful shit. Where would you like it? Where would you prefer it is? Well, we don't say, oh, by the way, if you prefer it here rather than there, your future bias, what do you think about the normative status of that? Mate, right? But that would clearly. So I think it's an interesting suggestion, but I sort of doubt that it works in this case just because I don't think any of these terms kind of pervade the milieu enough to kind of push people around. But I definitely agree with you that I think there will be some common evolutionary psychological story in common between this, but I just think there will probably be ways in which that story doesn't apply to all of them. So there'll be a kind of core thing with some add-ons, Megan, Jeremy, and Phillida, that play slightly different roles for these phenomena. So I don't think they're entirely distinct, for sure. I think there's a lot of overlap.
Kristie, apologies, Chris, on you again.